The Centre presents a new podcast, CBME and You, a podcast devoted to promoting awareness and debate around controversial ethical issues in biomedicine.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 5 of CB Me and You. In today's episode, we discuss the role, if any, of religious bioethics. Should practitioners be able to religiously reject providing health treatment? Should religious researchers be able to publish religious views on controversial bioethics topics? Should we even be talking about this on a bioethics podcast? Joining us today is our very own Dr. Anantharaman Muralidharan from CBME. Murali, welcome to the pod.
Hey, great to be here.
Welcome, Murali. We are very excited to have you on the pod. Our very first question for you, copy or coffee?
Kopi.
What's your order?
Kopi C. No, actually, just kopi.
Just coffee.
Yeah, because I ask for kopi C, I'm going to add sugar to it anyway. Might as well just get kopi.
Yeah.
Do you have a particular place that you get it from that's your favourite?
No, I just get it from the science camp.
Oh, that's not even coffee. That's coffee C.
That's kopi C. That's true. So I'm not generally a coffee drinker as such, but I drink coffee or kopi for necessity, and sometimes it's whatever's available, but the one at the science canteen it's nice when we add enough sugar.
And how do you feel about the current price increase from 90 cents to $1?
It was a controversy.
It was. There were protests.
Riots in the streets almost.
Yeah.
Were you among the rioters?
No. I mean, it's like inflation, yeah. And move on.
He signed an NDA.
I don't drink kopi, not in this economy.
Our next question for you, which country would you like to travel to next?
Okay, so I've got a clarificatory part about that. Are you
Here
asking?
we go.
Okay, are you asking? Okay, which country? Does this include countries I'm already planning to go to, and whether I'm looking forward to them? Or are you talking about apart from the countries that I'm already planning to go to? What do I want to visit next?
So we're going to skip this question. You lost question privileges. It just means that if you could take a pick as to which country you would go to next, that's the country you would go to.
Oh, actually, I miss England a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, like not England as such, UK. I like to go to Wales.
Ah, interesting. A particular part of Wales?
Usually the North Country in Wales, because the flowers are nicer and there are more nice castle ruins, and it's a very wonderful drive. If you're driving from England to Wales, you can tell when you entered Wales. Reason not because everything has the multiple L's and Y's. There's that.
The increased signage of it against England, just in general.
But it's just it's like the foliage is entirely different. So it's like say it's March now, right? Mid-March already. So leaves are out, right? You're driving and it's green. And then the first burst of colour you see, you're in Wales.
You know, that was surprisingly sweet.
Surprisingly detailed.
Very poetic.
Yeah. Well, nobody has justified their answer to this question as much as you have. Well done.
Given his research is in the public justification.
Yeah.
On brand.
We should have seen this coming.
Yeah, we should have. Okay.
I hope you're all buckled in, ladies and gentlemen, and all listeners. We're going to take you for a long drive.
Next question. I know it's your favorite. What is your favorite karaoke song?
Maybe I'm Amazed by Paul McCartney.
Can you just give us like a little snippet?
Maybe I'm amazed at the way you love me all the time. Maybe I'm amazed at the way I love you.
I think I know 2 Paul McCartney songs. One is the Kanye West Rihanna song. And one is the drum solo from, is it the Gorilla movie?
You said you know 2 Paul McCartney songs. I still haven't heard 2 Paul McCartney songs.
I'm feeling attacked. Excellent. We look forward to doing that with you at your birthday karaoke.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Are you ready for some serious questions now?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so in this episode, we want to deal with the topic of religious bioethics. And I think it's not exactly clear just from the sound of it what the scope of this discussion is. I think roughly what we want to get at is the idea of people using religious arguments or using religious concepts in their bioethical practice, and how, why, or whether they should be doing that. Is that roughly correct, Murali?
There is that, and that's certainly part of it, but it also involves a lot of personal decisions as well. Okay, cards on the table. I myself am religious as well. I'm a Hindu. I'm a practicing Hindu, but sometimes, for example, some of the decisions I make in my day-to-day life are driven by my religion. Sometimes it's like what I eat. That's driven by my religious beliefs, right? And I'm not saying that people can't do that when it comes to their medical decisions, right? So sometimes, like if a Jehovah's Witness feels that due to their religion, they cannot accept blood transfusions, that's perfectly fine, right? I think that's because of my different religious beliefs, think that's a deeply regrettable decision, right? But my principle that we shouldn't impose our religious beliefs on others, or our moral beliefs on people who reasonably disagree, that principle means that, well, we cannot force a Jehovah's Witness to accept the blood transfusion.
But how do we define religious bioethics? Are we just talking about, for example, any doctor who happens to have a religion? Or are you referring to something a bit more specific than that?
How I define it is any bioethical claim which is grounded in religious doctrine. So, for example, so sometimes it's not for any specific position, but sometimes it also involves the particular way in which you reach that position, right? So, for example, if you're against euthanasia, for instance, or assisted dying for religious reasons, because your religion says that all life is precious, no matter how much suffering it is, and therefore it's a sin to forcibly take a life or deliberately take a life. That's a religious bioethical position, that euthanasia is wrong and you've got it for a particular religious reason.
Right. What about cases where you have religious beliefs that just converge with a lot of non-religious views? For example, a lot of religions believe you should help people in need. Do those kinds of positions count as religious bioethical positions?
So, as I was saying, right, it's not the position itself, right? Because just as there are people who are against euthanasia for religious reasons, there are people who are against euthanasia for non-religious reasons, right? And this holds true for not just euthanasia, for almost just about every other bioethical position. I'm not sure there's any one bioethical position that that's only endorsed by people of a particular religion, right? Usually there's some other non-religious moral viewpoint that is, at least notionally, can support that view, or for the matter, like even explicitly religious organizations try to offer some kind of non-religious rationale for the particular view. So it's a combination of both a position and the particular way in which it's reached, right? So, for example, someone who endorses a particular religious bioethical viewpoint and is insofar as they arrived at that position and they maintain that position for religious reasons.
So do you need both for it to count as for our purposes?
Yeah.
Do you need both? You need to have both a religious starting point, a religious reasoning, I guess.
Yeah.
And you need to have a conclusion that without that religion, you probably wouldn't get to that same conclusion.
It doesn't have to be the case that without the religion you wouldn't get to the same conclusion because of the convergence between views. So I'm willing to count someone who says, well, we should help the poor in this case because, well, it's it's part of my religious tenets to help the poor. And you might think, though, that's throwing a very wide net, right? And part of this is, granted, it is throwing a wide net, but there is a phenomenon that is not just a matter of substantive positions and the particular ways in which we reach there, that is unique to at least really people who explicitly espouse religious points of views in bioethics. And that's where certain interesting things come in, right? And it's basically, it goes into the kind of dialectic that religious bioethicists use, the kind of dialectic that goes on when religious bioethicists try to say stuff. That's very different from how, say, a utilitarian or someone else will try to make their point. And we can see this difference in the kinds of arguments they make, and in the kinds of arguments they at least signal that they're prepared to offer, or the kind of moves that they're prepared to offer. Okay? So, for example, a utilitarian, right? He will say, okay, utilitarianism requires this, and then he says, well, suppose you're not a utilitarian, he will try to come, okay, here are good reasons why you should be a utilitarian. Well, either those arguments work, or if they don't, he'll try to offer different ones, and maybe he can go back and forth. And in principle, maybe he's committed to either offering different justifications if he wants to maintain his utilitarianism, or revising his utilitarianism in some way. Now, I'm not saying that religious bioethicists do something slightly different. They don't say, this is my religion. Here are the reasons why, for example, you should follow my religion instead of others. This is what it requires. They say, here's my religion. It's a reasonable view. Include our voice in it. And therefore, you should include our voice in various public policy making, or various social policies, or decision-making bodies and stuff like that. And that we want our voice heard because ours is a reasonable voice, not my view is in fact right.
It sounds to me that this distinction ends up a little fuzzy, because it sounds to me like the distinction is basically a matter of how people communicate their views, because a religious person could communicate their view in terms of, hey, look, this is my religious view. This is why I think you should agree with my religious view, adopt my religious view, and here's what it would say if you were committed to my religious position. Like, they could say that.
They could say that, but they don't, and for good reason, right? Because when things get down to it, there is a difference between, say, very generic philosophy, the God of the philosophers, the particular details of any given religious doctrine. For example, right?
The God of the philosophers.
Who's that?
Hypatia.
Nice.
So, for example, it's one thing to claim that perhaps some kind of omnibenevolent, omnipresent, omnipotent being exists, and maybe it's the source, created the world and stuff. And it's another to say, so-and-so was his prophet, or so-and-so was his incarnation, who came down to earth at this particular point in time, and performed such and such miracles, right? So that means that there are particular historical claims that are maybe more or less fantastic, and there are particular abstract theological claims, right? And the kind of particular religious doctrines which can actually get you to particular moral claims require the kind of historical claims, that particular religious doctrines have. Why? Because you can't just get from abstract claims about God, whether he exists or not, to any kind of any substantive moral position. What you do need is claims about revelation, claims about God has given people a message, and this is the message, and that is why this is the right thing to do, right? And in order to do that, you need to have these kinds of specific historical claims. Now, just because a claim is historical doesn't mean it's implausible, but the sheer fact is that we live in a world where there are many religions stretching back thousands of years. So everybody has, or almost every major world religion has all of these kinds of testimonial claims, testimonial claims about the particular historical events and particular revelations that conflict with each other. It's just not possible for someone to say that, to do special plead for their own religious doctrine, right? They just can't.
But aren't things often a little bit more complicated in terms of the content of religious beliefs? For example, a few weeks ago, we had Alexa down talking about Taoism and how at least the philosophical side of Taoism has implications for bioethics. But of course, there's some overlap between the philosophical Taoism and Taoism as a religion. I guess what I'm saying is that it's not always clear when a claim is more religious in character, as you might say, and comes from revelation, and when it's a kind of like philosophical claim, or at least a claim that's based on the kinds of methods that we're familiar with in philosophy, which is using reason to figure out what kinds of claims are reasonable and accurate, and using certain standards of logic.
Right. I mean, that's fair, right? So that means that it might turn out, and like for example, lots of religions have bodies of religious disputation, theological argument, and a lot of this theological argument, sometimes just philosophical argument, right? And so that's fair, right? But there's a question, I think, and so I'm not saying there's a sharp boundary between religious and non-religious bioethics, but I don't think there needs to be a sharp boundary between religious and non-religious bioethics. There are clear-cut cases of religious bioethics, there are clear-cut cases of non-religious bioethics, and there are kind of fuzzy areas in between which we're not sure which. You can decide, and because they play by different rules, maybe in the fuzzy regions you can decide which set of rules you want to play with. Deciding if you want to play by the religious rules, you don't get to have your voice in the public square. And if you want to play by the philosophical standards, then by the philosophical rules, then you get to be threatened by the very real chance that people will find very strong arguments against your position and just, completely rubbish your position. So that's the threat that you have.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Which is the whole point of this podcast. Nice.
Not you.
Wow. So one of the things you've said is that people can hold religious views and get to an end point where they say, for example, God has a no-kill policy, killing is wrong, therefore we shouldn't allow assisted dying.
Yeah.
And then you've also said that people could, theoretically, just drop that first sentence and go, killing is wrong, therefore assisted dying is wrong.
Yeah.
So if the outcome is the same, then why does it matter whether or not we identify these as religious or non-religious? Because it would be reasonable for someone to say killing is wrong. We just don't need to ask them about the metaphysical nature of where they got that argument from.
It does matter, at least sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. There are some arguments. Let me give a case example, right? So Sandel, when he's talking against human enhancement, says that...
But we're talking about Michael Sandel?
Yes.
Yeah, just for...
Yes, Michael Sandel. When he's talking about human enhancement, one of his arguments against human enhancement is that, all this talk about dignity and everything else kind of forgets is that and the whole modern outlook that forgets is the so-called giftedness of our faculties, right? And these are gifts to us. The way he puts it, right, it sounds deep and wise, but it's very religious. Why? Because if they are gifts, right, the only way you can get from our abilities being gifts to it being impermissible to tamper with whatever the natural lottery of our gifts is if there's something like, these are gifts from God, and it's wrong to play God, right? You need those two claims. If it's not wrong to play God, right, then the mere fact that they're gifts from God doesn't...
I would like to raise an objection here based on the movie Kung Fu Panda. So I recently rewatched this movie, and there is an excellent quote in there from Master Oogway, minutes before Oogway ascends by, is it John Powell or Hans Zimmer?
John Powell.
And he turns into cherry blossom leaves and then disappears into the spirit world. He says something along the lines of, what is it? Do you know the quote I'm talking about, Jacob?
I do not.
Oh, come on, man. It's like, the past is history, the future is mystery, today's a gift. That is why it's called the present. Yeah. No one's making a religious claim there. You can have a gift without a giver.
It's a silly bit of wordplay, though.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's okay. It's a beautiful bit of silly wordplay.
It hurt my feelings.
Yeah, but I think that speaks an important point, that sometimes a word can have religious connotations or origin. For example, I believe even the word human dignity at least came from at least Christian theology at first, and then became a philosophical term.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they have to be, right?
No, so it doesn't mean they have to be, but sorry for interrupting.
So rude.
Off. Podcast ended.
Banned.
No!
Perma ban.
Okay, so now you're right. It doesn't have to be, but sometimes certain arguments hold water when they have those kinds of when you explicitly invoke the particular religious meaning, and sometimes the arguments just don't hold water if they don't, right? If we're talking about gift in its without a gift giver sense, what's the logical connection between something being a gift in this non-gift giver sense and exchanging that, and the wrongness of, for example, exchanging that gift for something else? Okay, imagine you get a birthday present. It's rude and insulting to your gift giver to exchange your birthday present for something else that you'd like
I don't
more.
think this argument is going to hold up if we played White Elephant at Christmas time. The whole point of the game is that you don't know who your gift giver is.
Okay, that's true. But those are the internal rules of that game.
Well, see, now we're putting some constraints on it, which means the water is no longer holding in the cup.
Yeah.
We you know what, we've delayed by Michael Sandels, and I think a good argument would be the God has no kill policy, and therefore you can't you can't implement euthanasia. But as soon as you start implementing claims like this, there are also secular ways to get there.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is that when the only particular outcome of a religious claim is a particular religious outcome, or there is no secular way to get there, then it's not permissible in the public sphere?
So I'm not saying there's no secular way to get there, because I think that's too weak a requirement. I think I'm saying something much stronger. As long as there is some reasonable way in which you couldn't get there, as long as some reasonable moral doctrine, okay, so whether you're religious or not, right, whether a particular viewpoint is religious or not, as long as the conclusion places some kind of requirement on somebody that some other reasonable view couldn't get you to, you're not allowed to use that point of view to push that doctrine onto people.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying now.
Yeah, it sounds to me like the objection isn't just against religion then. It's really a really wide objection that applies to a lot of philosophical views, in fact.
Yes.
Like, for example, a common thing in bioethics is this idea that, the doing and allowing distinction. Yeah, that causing harm is not the same as allowing harm.
Yeah.
But there are some reasonable views that disagree with that.
Yeah.
Therefore, we can't.
Yeah. So I mean, whichever view of, so let's say you have two reasonable views. One has the doing allowing distinction. One doesn't have that. Whichever of these views is the more demanding one, we can't use that distinction to.
So we can't distinguish between murder and manslaughter because some people don't accept the doing allowing distinction.
I'm not sure that follows.
Well, murder is causing the death of another.
Manslaughter.
Manslaughter is allowing the death of another.
Not quite, right?
Manslaughter accounts for things like criminal negligence. Like if you fail to do something that you were supposed to do and then someone dies, it's manslaughter. You didn't intend to kill them, but based on an action that you did, you allowed someone to die when you shouldn't have.
There are active forms of manslaughter too, aren't there?
Yeah.
Are there?
Yeah, like getting really angry and punching somebody really hard and then they fall down and hit their head.
But does that mean that we shouldn't allow the...
So I'm not sure that the doing allowing distinction is what underlies manslaughter anyway.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's intent, but still.
But intent would also fall under the kind of net that you're casting here, because many philosophers do, reasonably it seems, disagree that intent makes a difference to the morality of an act.
Same, got that different way.
So, but now we have to ask who is in fact imposing something on what. So what's being imposed on who in this case, right? So
government is imposing different mandatory sentencing laws on people who commit those crimes.
So perhaps
based on a distinction that people cannot reasonably disagree with, or do reasonably disagree with.
So based on a decision on principles that people reasonably disagree with, the government is treating people differently, and that seems wrong. Yeah, I'm willing to bite the bullet. Yeah.
No, it's so rare that you meet someone that's, yep, you know what?
Yeah,
Sure.
that is the logical consequence of my argument.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, so next question then, now that we've established this. I'm not, you know what, I think we can just agree to disagree on that point. So what then is the problem with religious bioethics? So if a pluralist society, so one such as Singapore or Australia or pretty much most places, accept the rights of people to express their opinions and accepts that we shouldn't force our views on each other, is then rejecting the role of religious bioethics simply us forcing our view on them?
No, it's not, and for two reasons, right? First of all, it's the question of what table is religious bioethics being excluded from. So it's being excluded from a much more public-facing role, right? So that means that religious bioethics shouldn't be in the business of telling people what to do, especially when this is people who reasonably disagree with that religion. Especially when the telling is not just, oh, this is a nice suggestion. No. This is going to, for example, the law, where you have the state which will coercively make people abide by certain requirements that people with certain religious or philosophical views could reasonably disagree with. Like, for example, it allows people for religious reasons to say, no, look, my religion allows this. Don't force me to do something that my religion is saying is perfectly okay. There's an asymmetry here, right? It's on the kind of claim that we're making, right? So are people making a demand on others? That means, is someone saying, you should do this or you shouldn't do this? Or is someone saying, hey, I'm allowed to do this? And there's an asymmetry between people who say, hey, I'm allowed to do this. Those people, right, in whatever context can invoke their religious beliefs, right? So long as it's a reasonable religious belief. While those who are saying, hey, you should do this, you shouldn't do this, those people, well, are not allowed to invoke views that people could reasonably disagree with to get there.
It sounds to me that your view is that there's a kind of default stance that we should take with respect to all people, and it's kind of the stance of non-interference, right? You don't tell people what to do unless there's a reason that every reasonable person can agree with, and then we'll tell somebody what to do. Is that?
I mean, pretty much, right? Because we're all moral equals here, right? We're all persons. We all have at least a very minimal capacity to think about what's right and wrong. We all have the capacity to at least, with maybe sufficient help, and we work it out, maybe a piece of paper or something, figure out what we ought to do. And if that's the case, I don't get, unless, I've got superior evidence to you, or you've clearly made a mistake in your reasoning, to tell you what to do, right? Because if you've made a mistake in your reasoning, then all that means is that I'm just helping you see here, you made a mistake in your reasoning. If you didn't make that mistake in your reasoning, you would agree with me, and you would decide, and you would see that you have to do what you ought to do, what I'm telling you to do anyway, right? In those kinds of cases, I'm just helping you do what, by your own light, by your own reasons, right, you ought to do anyway, right? And this basic moral equality between people, right? That no one is a person's default natural master, no one is someone else's natural slave, right? No one as long as we're talking about competent adults here, we're all moral equals.
So should doctors then be allowed to reject providing legal and justified services such as abortion and assisted dying on religious grounds?
So yes, my view does allow for a wider range of conscientious objection. That said, things get a bit complicated here. It's partly because there's a kind of public trust that's involved in being a doctor, right? In virtue of setting up your practice, or of being a practicing physician, right? There are certain things that at least implicitly you're claiming to certain kind of services you're claiming to offer, right? Now, we can't take this too far to completely say that, well, that means doctors have no ability to conscientiously object. But we have to be very careful and look at the particular social circumstances to any particular service is part of the contract, right? For example, if you're an OBGYN, right, it's going to be a lot harder for you to say, well, no, I can't perform abortions at least where, especially those which appear more medically necessary, and especially when you're you're not explicitly part of a very religious practice. I think things matter if you're, for example, part of like an explicitly religious hospital. I doubt anybody expects a Catholic hospital, for example, to provide abortions. People don't expect a Catholic hospital to provide abortions.
Well, it depends. If it's publicly funded, then yeah.
Well, so that's a different, right? So that means if it's publicly funded, then again, things change, right?
And if it's the only one in the area, if it's going to make the person extremely difficult to access an abortion at all, are these things as well that you consider?
Does it matter whether? So some of these things are, again, things get hard because these questions get hard because if you're the only hospital in the area, are you allowed to then say you're not providing certain services? Sometimes that occurs for certain private hospitals and emergency services, right? You know, like for example, some private hospitals, their emergency services are just in name only. I wouldn't go to them for
Wait, you wouldn't go to them? Or there's actually no emergency room, it just says emergency, and if you go in there, there's just like a wall. That's what I'm imagining.
There is one doctor who may or may not distribute your organs to 5 other needy people.
I'm
just so happy that you got to bring that up into this podcast, James.
No, but I mean, it's like, look, you may not have the full suite of services that, for example, a full-fledged emergency department in, for example, SGH or NUH would have. Even though they have emergency on their thing, no public ambulance would actually take any patients to those hospitals, and they shouldn't because they are not prepared to take on emergency cases.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't know these hospitals existed, but
they do.
Thank you for enlightening me.
So what you're saying is, if a hospital is already going to deny services for some reasons, then religious reasons are acceptable as well.
Yes.
And there's no distinction there on the grounds that it's reasonable to disagree with those, so they shouldn't be using those reasons.
So it's not a matter of whether they should be used. We shouldn't be using those reasons because people reasonably disagree about that. We shouldn't be using our reasons, because again, our reasons are also reasons that people can reasonably disagree with, right? To make demands on them. So it goes both ways, right? It's not that, religion is unique in this particular way, right? I'm saying that, look, my particular permissive view is also a view that people can reasonably disagree with. The only thing that we can require of each other is something that we all reasonably agree is required.
Okay. This is interesting because in certain circumstances, for example, in the case where you have a hospital in an area and they're the only ones who are capable of providing a certain kind of treatment, to not provide that treatment for certain reasons would, in a way, be an imposition on people, right? If I go up to a hospital asking for a specific kind of treatment
for shingles,
and maybe the doctor is religious and believes that, the hospital is religious and believes that shingles is something that God intends for you to
deal with it on your own.
Experience, to deal with on your own. By refusing to treat me, they're putting an imposition on me.
So again, this is balanced by the reasonableness of the view. Not everything, you don't get to call a view reasonable just because someone claims it under the name of religion. There are certain kind of epistemic standards that it must abide by.
So not all religious reasons are equal?
No.
How do you get to pick which ones are?
I mean, that's something that we have to kind of work through and see. For instance, right, not in the moral realm, but think about something like young earth creationism. It's the view that the world is roughly about 4,000 or 6,000 years old, and scientific evidence to the contrary. I think that's just an unreasonable view because the best scientific evidence, it's more probable that the scientific evidence is, as the scientific evidence reliably tells us, the Earth is billions of years old. Then it's likely that the whole thing is a hoax, or that we're all being deceived by some kind of evil demon.
Aren't there some people out there who will challenge this and say, well, all religions are unreasonable? It's like there's some people who believe that religion is unreasonable because they think that, well, there's no evidence for God, therefore all religion is unreasonable. So how would you, I guess, say that religion is there's religion in itself that's reasonable, and then there's some specific views within religion that just fails this reasonable test?
I mean, this is a hard question. In part because
we're not here to take it easy on you, really.
In part because this depends on these questions about what the right epistemic standards are, what arguments or evidence there is for certain religious views, and it also depends partly on what evidence someone has been exposed to, right? If someone, right, has been exposed to a lot of testimonial evidence that in favor of their own religious view, knows of other testimonial evidence for contrary views, but hasn't really been exposed to them, even though they're in a very different evidential situation than from someone who's exposed to maybe very little testimonial evidence about religion or testimonial evidence about a different religious belief. These things matter. And the same applies for things like arguments for the existence of God, and depending on how you define God, depending on how on the particular details of the argument, some of these arguments are more plausible, some of these are not. For example, right, you might say, well, you might think, like, for example, if you're a kind of Spinozist kind of pantheist, you might think that yes, God exists because maybe, and you might say trivially because everything is God. And some people might say, why call that God? Sure, there are many religious traditions where that kind of view, God just doesn't count as that kind of view, right? But there are also plenty of religious traditions where that's explicitly part of the religious doctrine that when people are talking about God, they really are talking about just everything that exists.
It seems to me that there's a bit of cultural relativity inbuilt into this epistemic standard then, because to me, I was raised Catholic, so to me, believing that there is a God seems like a religious view. It's a religious view. It seems like a reasonable view for somebody to have. But if somebody said, if something like believing in Thor or Zeus, well, that's a bit silly. But I have to admit that if we grew up in a culture where belief in Thor or Zeus was more common, and more people sincerely had religious revelations where they believe that they talk to Thor, I'd have to admit that maybe it's reasonable to admit that.
It's not so much It's not so much cultural relativist as it's just a basic evidentialist view, right? In a society where people claim to have religious revelations about Thor, that's just a matter of you're now receiving a lot more testimonial evidence in that society about Thor than you are about Jesus and Mary, right? While in a society where more people are raised Roman Catholic and claim to have religious revelations about Jesus and Mary, Jesus and Mary. Well, you have different evidence about Jesus and Mary than you have in the society where you have Thor. So, insofar as you must proportion your belief to your evidence, when you have different evidence, you have different beliefs become reasonable.
We have time for one last question, and I think it has all been leading to this moment, and I'm so excited for your answer. When, if any, is religious bioethics allowed a seat at the policy table?
So, my view here is going to be twofold. When religious bioethics is making claims that are, let's call them biorestrictionist, that means they want to restrict what people can or cannot do, right? It's not allowed on the table. And in this way, religious bioethics is no different from non-religious bioethics. Okay?
So like restricting people's access to healthcare.
Yes. Or like restricting what people can do, what people are allowed or not allowed to do. Right? When religious bioethics doesn't do that, it's not at the policy-seeking table either. Because imagine a case, right? Imagine a case where you have a very liberal or permissive religious view that people discussing, is this right or wrong? And I think one thing that comes up often, right? So it's not that it's not allowed at the table. There's no motivation for people with permissive religious views to bring their views to the table. Why? Because when something is allowed by common morality, right? The same morality that, or at least the kind of principles that everybody does accept, there's no particular need to bring a particular religious view to the table.
So let's say a religion says you should drink water. And because everyone believes that, then there is no need for it to be at the policy table because there is no policy about it.
Yeah.
What about the kind of model that I know that policy making in Singapore sometimes uses, or sometimes claims to use this? I don't know what happens in the room where it happens. It's kind of like a consensus building kind of project. You get a bunch of people, religious people, at the table to discuss an issue with the aim of trying to get a bit of a consensus going out of that. So there's religion, but also you try to use that opportunity to iron out disagreement.
I mean, you might think that works, but you might think that would abide by my public justification requirement, but it doesn't. It actually gets the opposite thing. What happens is that each individual religion has its own specific restriction and own specific issue with the more permissive position. And so they each decide to add in their requirements. So instead of having the least restrictive requirement that everybody can agree on, or at least not all the time, but at least what you often get is what everybody can cram in their particular restriction on what people can do. In a society where the least restrictive position is, say, A, like for example, again, medical assistance in dying. The consensual, do it only when it's consensual is the least restrictive, reasonable position. Then, let's say 4 of the 5 major religions in the society think that that's wrong, that it should be forbidden. Maybe one or maybe the secular guys who think that it's perfectly okay, right, are left without a voice, or are left having to compromise with the religious people, meet them halfway. But even meeting them halfway is some kind of imposition. So either you're required to compromise, and that is still some imposition on people who reasonably disagree, because if the least restrictive reasonable position is in fact a reasonable position, compromising from that means being more restricted than the least restrictive position. So when governments try to say, okay, we'll bring you to the table, and you kind of hammer it out and compromise between yourselves, you're still imposing something on people who reasonably disagree.
It sounds like that's all the time we have, so thank you for joining us.
And thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks for listening to our new podcast. Subscribe online and tune in every first of the month. In the meantime, listen to CBME and you, and be savvy.